Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you. That was good. I am Noah Tolley, Senior Fellow for Global Cities at the Council, and I am thrilled to welcome our panel today. Thank you for joining us for two back-to-back sessions here with a flash talk and short break in between. Thank you to our sponsors, our international and civic partners, and our delegates. Our first panel will be on the inclusive city. That will be followed by combating violence and building unity. In between, UL's Todd Hone will present his flash talk on global cities, global health. We encourage you to tweet using the tag @ChicagoForum and the hashtag GlobalCities2016. Tweet anytime to ask questions of the panel during Q&A at the end of the discussion. And now, please join me in welcoming panel moderator Edward Luce, Elizabeth Dozier, Claudio Orrego, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and Dorothee Stapelfeldt.
Counts correctly.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for hosting this in such a beautiful setting. I'm looking here at the dome above, this beautiful ornate dome, and the Millennium Park beyond, and it's a sort of perfect expression of what a modern global city should look like. Beautiful setting. Also, the weather gods for the second consecutive year are smiling on us, so that's another bonus. So we're here to talk about the inclusive city. Now, inclusivity is very much in the eye of the beholder, but I think a lot of us tend to think of cities nowadays, the most modern, economically successful cities, through the prism of Richard Florida's well-read classic, modern classic really, The Rise of the Creative Class, in which he makes the argument not just that inclusivity is a good in itself, but that diversity is something to be aimed for. Diversity is something that is economically desirable. So these are really the three T's, talent, technology, and tolerance. Tolerance being absolutely key to those three T's. And I think that that's an important point to make in terms of a discussion about inclusivity. It's a two-sided coin. One side is inclusivity, the other side is diversity. And I think it's a particularly important discussion to be having here in the United States when we're approaching a general election in which one of the candidates talks about breaking down barriers, very much in the traditional mold of an America connected with the world, an America that's happy with modernity and the future, and with cities and city culture and diversity, namely Hillary Clinton. For those who didn't guess, against another candidate, namely Donald Trump, who's talking of building walls and going very much against the grain of American history in the last 70 years, of talking against immigration, of talking about tearing up trade deals, and of, if you like, in his whole America First agenda, not really even talking about all Americans. There are some Americans who are more American than others in that context. Now, you'll notice I'm not being particularly balanced here. You're not going to get false equivalence from me. I am an opinion journalist rather than a reporter, so I do have some license to give my views. But we do have a perfect setting, really, of an inclusive candidate, a traditional inclusive democratic presidential nominee, and one who's not very inclusive at all. Bearing that political climate in mind, let me introduce each of the guests in slightly more detail. We've got Dorothee Stapelfeldt, who is a long-serving member of the Social Democratic Party, in Hamburg, and is was senator in the Ministry for Urban Development and Housing. Next to Dorothee, we have Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's head of the New America Foundation and chief executive of it, was formerly head of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, head of policy and planning at the State Department, and many other things. Next to her is Claudio Orrego, who is the governor, the appointed still governor of the larger metropolitan region of Santiago in Chile, appointed by the person who defeated him in the presidential election from the Christian Democrat Party of Chile. A large city, a job I believe that's about to become an elected job rather than an appointed job, and one I think that you might be preparing to run for. And then last but very much not least, Liz Dozier, who first really came to fame in Chicago when she turned around at the Fenger High School in the far south side, a failing high school with high truancy rates, high rates of violence, and really changed those numbers dramatically and created a model that other schools, not just in Chicago, but in other American cities have looked to, and is now head of Chicago Beyond, which looks at youth, education, inclusion, and violence. So welcome to all of you. This is really a perfect panel, a perfect range of expertise to discuss a complex problem. Let me start, if I may, Anne-Marie, with you. Now, you can think of that Richard Florida coin of diversity and inclusivity being both different sides of the same coin. You've clearly got highly diverse cities like Chicago, which are highly democratic, but not inclusive, not very inclusive. And you can think at the other end of the scale of a country like, or a city-state like Singapore, which is very diverse, very inclusive, but not very democratic. Now, you've famously written the best read article in the Atlantic Monthly's history, highest number of hits, called Women Still Can't Have It All. My question to you is, can cities have it all? Can you be free, highly democratic, highly diverse, and highly inclusive at the same time?
Thank you. So I want to start just by saying the one thing you didn't say about my background that is particularly relevant in this setting is I started my academic career teaching at the University of Chicago Law School and was married on Promontory Point. And I'm so happy to be back in Chicago, particularly when the weather's like this. So. And I should also say, this is a test of posture.
It is, sorry.
So if I'm sitting rather oddly, it's because I don't want to go to sleep after lunch in these lovely armchairs. But to your question, I think it's a very important question. I mean, you start by the distinction between diversity and inclusivity. And of course, the way to think about that is ending segregation in Brown v. Board did not mean integration. If anything, we're more segregated now than we've ever been. So diversity, you can have incredible diversity and be deeply, deeply segregated. And I think, people using it loosely might think, oh, it's diverse, it's inclusive. No, they really do have to go together. And in some way, it's the more diverse you are, the harder it is to be fully inclusive. Hence your point that if you have an autocracy, you can force integration. And really, when you look at Singapore's history, Lee Kuan Yew had 3 ethnic groups who were historically at war with each other. And one of his great achievements was to essentially just dictate that there will not be ethnic strife. Although Singapore, too, still works on real inclusion versus a fully, an open democracy where people just say, nope, sorry, I want mine and I'm not going to share. So I think my answer to your question is you can do all 3 in good times, right? When the pie is expanding and you have good policy and good leadership, absolutely, you can get a democratic, diverse, and inclusive city. In hard times, that is very hard to do. Now, I won't say impossible, but inevitable, unless you have an extremely strong culture, and that culture itself requires integration, right? I mean, it requires that when somebody gets shot, you think of that person not as an African-American kid who you have no connection to, but as, my God, that's my teenage son. But that's only going to happen if you have a certain amount of integration to begin with. So in a city, as most cities, that is trying to be more inclusive, is very diverse, and in economic hard times, I'd say that's extremely hard to do in a democracy.
So easier when the rising tide is lifting all boats, which it clearly isn't in Chicago. Liz, bearing in mind what Anne-Marie's just said about Singapore, I mean, this was a very different time and a very different model of governance than you have in Chicago. But Lee Kuan Yew essentially said, with each apartment block, each housing project, we will have X number of Malays, X number of Chinese, X number of Tamils. And this is how it's going to go. We're going to force integrate you. And we'll do the same with schools, etc. This is as far as possible you can be, really, from the situation in Chicago, where, correct me if I'm wrong, but crudely speaking, you've got a third African American, a third Hispanic, and a third white in the south side, the west side, and the north side, to be simplistic, respectively. Now, you've done great work in the high school that you turned around and in Chicago and beyond. Is something more drastic needed to see real integration in Chicago?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I would just say, just growing up here in Chicago, I grew up on the far south side in the suburbs, but always went to school. My mom was a school teacher, so went to school on the south side of Chicago in the city. And I came to know Chicago as a very segregated place. And I really thought that's how the whole world was, right? I really remember thinking that everywhere in every city of America, it must be that people live by the color of their skin, essentially. And it wasn't until I remember, I think I was like 18, 19 years, I had gone away to college, and I went on a trip, and I was in Los Angeles, and I was blown away, and I mean, I'm 18 years old, blown away that people were, there was integration. Like, I didn't come to know the world in that way. And so I think it's interesting to think about. I think that it is definitely possible for Chicago to desegregate and to become more inclusive, but I think there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I don't think there's a silver bullet, and I think it's to some of the things that you spoke of, and I think it has to do with economic development in our areas. Oftentimes, economic crisis hits the country as a whole, but it completely obliterates our poorest areas and often obliterates the educational systems in those areas, and just the whole 9 yards. And so I think it requires conscious planning, not only on a political side, but a civic side and a community side, to really address the education and what's happening with our schools, and how we understand that fair does not always mean equal in that setting, and how we understand how to plan well so that there's economic development and vibrancy in all areas of our city. As I've spent more time now, I'm no longer on the south side of Chicago working every single day. I'm oftentimes awestruck. Even as I was having lunch this afternoon, I was walking to get here, and it's so beautiful.
I know.
Chicago is so beautiful. I think about what my days look like, on the far south side of Chicago, and it didn't look that way, and there were gunshots, and there were things happening. And so I think when we talk about inclusivity, we have to talk about a multifaceted solution. There has to be, consciously done.
I'm right in thinking that there are people in the south side, there are kids who take day trips down here to the Magnificent Mile, to this stunning sort of urban global city that we're talking in, who've never been here before, for whom it's a complete eye-opener. This is also my city. This is Chicago. Is there something there that, in terms of public transportation, in terms of sort of political priorities, that's lacking?
I think that there's obviously, when we talk about economic development and education, there's a dollars issue, right? But I also think there's there's a dialogue that needs to take place too. And so we can't talk about these types of things and exclude race and poverty and how all those interplay. And so I'm not sure how many of you are from Chicago or if you heard a few months ago when Donald Trump tried to come to town. And that did not work out very well for him here.
It worked out well.
It didn't work out very well for him here because people basically, you know, went out in the streets and were protesting and basically shut the whole show down. And I thought was remarkable when I was watching it on TV was that people were out there protesting from different parts of the city, different communities, different races, different, you know, and people were pissed and they were like, you know, he's pushing this us versus them, you know? And I was like, yeah, that's right, that's right. But as I started to reflect on it, really, like, do we not push that here in our own city? I mean, if we're really clear about what's happening with some of our kids, like, we have children, and I guess it's personal to me because I continue to lose my children, my students that continue to be shot and killed. Do we not have an us versus them stance when it comes to them? Like, is it not those kids over there? And we care in some way, right? And we say, oh, we have our Monday morning coffee and we say, oh, those, you know, 69 people shot and 4 people killed, you know, whatever. But like, is it not the same us versus them? And I oftentimes find that very interesting. So again, that dialogue there of really owning what is happening has to take first before we can even begin to put in measures to really address it.
So it's interesting, Donald Trump actually brought about an inclusive demonstration against him.
He did.
Dorothee, I mean, we've been talking here about, I guess, legacy divisions in Chicago with deep American historical roots, racial divisions, but you're in Hamburg dealing with a very recent emergency, potential new division, and that is your incorporation of thousands of refugees from very different cultures, I guess first and foremost Syria, but not just Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, in a very short space of time. Tell us a little bit about how you're absorbing them and what role you see them playing in German and Hamburg society once they've been absorbed.
Yeah, first of all, to give you an idea, I have to tell that the sister city of Chicago is Hamburg, has 1.8 million inhabitants, and in the former years we had about 5,000 refugees in our town, but in the last year we had more than 61,000 refugees in Hamburg.
So just to put that in context,
yeah.
America so far has taken 2,500, America has taken 2,500 Syrian refugees. So you've taken 60,000.
60,000, 61,000 refugees coming from Syria, 1/3 of them, and coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran, as you mentioned that. Of course, it was all in the last year. We had 1.5 million refugees coming to Germany, so that was a really big challenge for all the big cities in Germany. And what we had to do was things like that. First of all, we had to build up central refugee shelters for the first 6 months. So now we have about 40 in our city. Then the refugees have to stay there for the first 6 months, but then they have to move to other accommodations, which are state-sponsored, because they are not able to get an apartment by themselves. And we had to build up also those accommodations in more than 100 places. Well, let's say 61,000 people are like a little town of like Bloomingdale here in Illinois. So it was really, first of all, it was really difficult because we have to fit all the accommodation and the care. Of course, we have to. They need care because they hadn't anything bring with them, and of course not only the care for the costs, daily costs, but also for medical care. And what is really, I think, very important, we start with the education especially also in the age before they go to school, children from 3 to 7, they are entitled to places in the kindergartens. That is, I think it's really important also in terms of integration.
How are you dealing with what I understand is a growing backlash against the influx of refugees?
Yes, well, the people in Hamburg and in other cities in Germany, sometimes if they are not on the right side of the society and not so wealthy, so they sometimes fear about their own existence because there is a competition, or there will be a competition, especially regarding the housing. That's a very difficult problem in Hamburg. So we are a growing city. More than 10,000, 12,000 people are coming each year. So we have to strengthen our program for normal housing. And we have a special program for the housing for the refugees, because we know that otherwise there will be a competition between those who are looking for renting an apartment and the refugees.
So I want to get back to your sort of longer term vision for the inclusion, the absorption of these outsiders who've come in. But let me just turn to Claudio. Now, we've been talking really so far about ethnic and racial diversity and to some degree religious diversity. Santiago is, I guess, a relatively undiverse city compared to Chicago and increasingly Hamburg, certainly to London, New York, even to your fellow Latin American capitals. You're relatively undiverse, say, compared to Brazil, by that measure of diversity. Do you feel you should be more diverse, bearing in mind the sort of Richard Florida dictum that diversity is good? It's the spark, the clash of ideas, of peoples, of cultures that creates economic energy and entrepreneurial spirit. Do you think Santiago should be more diverse?
Well, I think Santiago is becoming more diverse through the immigration of different Latin American countries to our country due to our economic success. However, thinking about inclusivity and diversity only on race terms or religious terms kind of really strikes me, because we are a city in Santiago with a huge social segregation. You can be in one part of Santiago and you will feel like in Switzerland, and you can be 30 minutes away in another part of Santiago where you feel in Burundi. And you mentioned this, I don't know, you mentioned our kids or my kids. I think one of the pending challenges of democracy in Latin America, after all our fight to come back to democracy after military coups in almost every Latin American country, was to go further in terms of what do human rights mean. Not only political rights, to vote, to express yourself in a free way, not only the economic right to work, but there are also social and urban rights. I don't want to live in a city where people they're not willing to speak about our city, because there are like 2, 3, 4 different cities, and where you will have one part of the city with 20, 30 square meters of green areas per citizen, and others with less than 1 square meter. And with garbage in the streets. And so I know that social inequality takes a long time to break, education, job, productivity, but urban inequality is more easy to break. I would say, in our view, it's kind of a shortcut to equality and to make our city more inclusive. And it has to do with not only parks, with transport you mentioned, with schools. We're talking with Liz. We in Santiago have 36,000 kids between 6-year-old and 18 that are not in school. So what are we doing with that? All of them in poor areas.
So as the governor of the Santiago Metropolitan region, you've got Burundi and Switzerland within your area, as you say. What power have you got to bring Burundi up to Switzerland? What resources have you got at your disposal?
I mean, we do have certain resources, and we have to invest them in a proactive way. You know, we're building right now 11 parks in the most poor parts of Santiago, high standard parks, and that we will put the money to maintain them, for example. We are building this program for, you know, dropout kids, and we're putting all the money for that. And we know it's more expensive in the short term. But if you will have that kid in jail for many years, believe me, all the money we could spend is still be the best investment for our city. And I would say my political challenge right now is to say that this inequality is key. I mean, to overcome this inequality is key to Santiago's future, both competitiveness, economic development, and political stability. If we are not able to tackle with this inequality, I think, you know, the social unrest, the violence and the crime, and the insecurity of the people will make it a less competitive city worldwide and countrywide. So I think we need money. We need, you know, committed public servants and teachers to do the work, but we need politicians that are able to link the fight with inequality with economic and social development. And unless we're able to put that topic on top of the agenda, we're going to miss the game. And I think we're missing it right now.
I mean, so there are several areas. I mean, I was, you know, perhaps some typecasting Donald Trump, and I think he deserves it, but the people who vote for him, the people who support him, a lot of them are, you know, victims, I guess, of economic exclusivity. They don't feel like they've been participating in the extraordinary wealth generation that goes on in other parts of the United States. And they're expressing their anger accordingly. And that anger might well come to threaten the very subject we're talking about, the inclusivity. So which cities do you look at, each of you, as models for how all kinds of inclusivity are done well? You know, including the economic piece, and including for women. I mean, I'm very pleased. It's not that often the majority of a panel is female, so I'm delighted to be moderating one. Which are the cities that you sort of think of as models? And I'd like each of you to think about that. But Dorothee, you know, from either the particular challenges you're facing in absorbing refugees on a grand scale, is there a model for that? Or the more general challenges of how you cope with a longer-term inclusivity agenda? Are there cities you look at and say, we need to learn from you?
Well, I think there are three keys to inclusivity. First of all, education, then jobs, professional skills, and housing. So then when you try to look up on other cities, they must be successful in education, jobs, and housing. So sometimes we look on the Scandinavian cities, of course, in the north and also in Netherlands. But I think that there are some models for us. Inclusivity is sometimes it's quite, you find affordable housing, for example, in Scandinavian cities. You find a kind of might be a better education also in German cities, but also in Europe. But as you see, we try to find the models in the special Europe ideal of a city. Yeah.
Looking outside of Europe, where would you look?
North America. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we can do that, and I think there are so many similar challenges. 2 days ago, I went to Artie Kotek here, and she explained to me what they are doing in business development and also housing. And of course, there are the same problems. Of course, we have also segregation in Hamburg. And what you have to do is to solve the problems on a quite residential area level. So all you have to do is to find to solve the problems there in housing, public space. But first of all, it is the education and to skill the people to be in employment. So I think you have quite a different unemployment rate that we have. But just to compare it with Chicago, but there are also other...
It's a very different kind of circumstance. I mean, if you look at there are all sorts of global rankings of cities that produce different results, but there's the livable cities, diversity index, there's, and of course cost of living. But one thing that's very striking about them is that more often than not, it's smaller cities like Copenhagen, Oslo, Seattle, Ottawa, which is not the most exciting of cities, but it's exciting in terms of global ranking in a lot of these surveys. And they're clearly also safer cities, aren't they, Anne-Marie? I mean, the sort of safety and inclusion of women going to work, women in their neighborhoods, is perhaps an under-discussed topic. When you think of it through that prism, which cities would you look at as models for how women live and thrive?
Oh, goodness. That one, I'm not sure I can answer. I mean, so I was thinking as you were saying the cities I look to, and the first thing I would say is the cities, the great cities of the United States, but particularly of Europe, because I'm half Belgian, so I grew up in Brussels. My mother was Belgian. We would go to Brussels every summer, and this is the 60s, and it's the civil rights movement in the United States, and it's riots, and my Belgian relatives were extraordinarily superior about how racist the United States was, and they, of course, were not. Well, they were also a pure white city, so it was easier to... But now I go to Brussels, or London, or Berlin, or Paris, and they are not inclusive, but they are infinitely more diverse. These cities are unrecognizable from what they were in the 60s and 70s. So it's not surprising you get diversity first, and then you need inclusivity. I think in the US, as you said, the cities that are doing the best, I think of Columbia, South Carolina, Charleston, Charlotte, which is working very hard actively on economic integration, Chattanooga, the Research Triangle. Jim Fallows has written in American Futures about a whole group of smaller American cities. And part of that, I think, is things have gotten bad, and they've got to figure out economically how to bring people in. And business is often saying, you know, we need people, we need workers, and the workers who are available are diverse. It's a diverse group, but they're not educated enough. So you have to have different education, different apprenticeships. When I think about the cities, Seattle might be another, but different contexts and different kinds of diversity. So that's what I think about. I think about inclusion and women. I don't think about safety, although perhaps I should. But what I think about there are cities that have paid family leave, right? Cities who make it possible, who mandate, often on a social insurance scheme, and more cities are doing this, that, you know, if you have to take care of somebody, be it your child, a parent, a spouse, whatever, you will not lose your job. That's important, MFLA, but equally importantly, we'll actually pay you. And will pay you enough so that you can take care of each other. Those are cities that make it much more possible for caregivers, who are still majority women, certainly, but need not be, to actually survive and thrive. And then cities, and I don't have any examples, sadly, but what I would look to are cities that hire, I'd like to see cities that hire women and they are largely still women, whose children have left the home, who are at the young age of their mid-50s. They're ready to go. Let's remember, if Hillary wins, she'll be 70 when she wins, and she could be president till 78. So if you're in your mid-50s, you've got as much of your career ahead of you as behind you. And why aren't we hiring those women? And the cities that were truly inclusive, I think, in terms of that kind of inclusivity, would set a standard there.
Dorothee, I have to ask, because it was so much in the news, the incident on New Year's Eve in Cologne,
Yes.
in the context of the backlash against immigrants and of perception of women, or reality of how women are impacted by that there are very clearly very different cultural values that some of the refugees might be bringing with them, or at least a perception that they've got very different cultural values. How are you coping with that? I mean, Hamburg's, got some problems, but potentially this is one of them, isn't it?
It is, of course, and it's very, very important for our cities that we have safety, and we are safe, especially for women, I would say. The events in Cologne and Hamburg, there were some sexual assaults against women, and you could only say that were men coming from other nationalities. So they were foreigners, but only part of them were refugees. And of course, after that, we say that we need a concept, though, that everybody knows a no is a no, yeah? So that, and of course, we must be, there must be the strong law on them, of course, and there were some people were judged in Hamburg. Unfortunately, we had not so many people, women who witnessed that, so that they could be, they could do some things against the men. But of course, we were not used to that in Germany. It was really unique at that time, and all the public was discussing it and discussing what we can do for the safety of women. And I think that's unless of course it's not, of course it is sad for the women who were, who had to harass that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, it's quite good to have that and public discussion, and you stick to the rules in Germany, of course, and the law.
Sorry,
Can I just ask a question, though? Is it really worse for women than for men? In other words, isn't it equally true, if you kept statistics, that the places where women are getting harassed, men are getting beat up? I mean, we all focus on it because it's women, but isn't it actually, I mean, to your point about just violence, are you also looking at whether or not those places are more violent for men? In other words, men who look different are getting beaten up?
Yes, of course we do. If they are not allowed to bring knives with them and so on, of course there is some kind of violence between young men too. But
just the women get special significance.
There was a very special situation in the New Year's celebration, and of course there were so many women hundreds of women. So in Cologne and in Hamburg. And
do you think that incident was sort of misdescribed by some people? Do you think some parts of the media sort of used this to exaggerate the number of refugees who were involved and create a political agenda out of it? I mean, I know there was a debate out of that, but...
Yeah, you have to deal with that because, of course, they try to have their stories in the media, and it comes together with prejudices in the society too. Yeah, so the people were talking about refugees, but they didn't know that were young men from foreign countries.
Yeah, no, you made that very clear. I mean, I'm thinking of that in particular. I mean, you could apply it to Chicago too. If you're thinking of young men, who might have a higher propensity to violence than young women, and from certain parts of town have higher statistical crime rates, that it must be awfully bleak to see the world reflect back at you what they think of you, what they expect from you. And you've dealt with this with young kids in the South Side. If we're talking about inclusion, this is the coalface, isn't it? This is where you succeed or fail, is giving people, young men and women, a stake in the future. What lessons do you think you can apply, Liz, from Fenger and other projects you've been involved, After School Matters, of course, that could be used in any context, in Chicago or beyond?
So I think what immediately strikes me is just the importance of the emphasis that we place on, before children get to their teenage years. Obviously, teenage years are not too late to turn around when things are not going in the right direction. But I always think back to when I first got to Fenger, and I was struck by the number of children that could not read. And so on average, roughly 40, sometimes 45% on average, would come in, and ninth graders, these are kids who are 14, 15 years old, and they would be reading at a third grade reading level or below, with some non-readers in the mix. And so, like on sight words, like a, the, and that's where they were in terms of their reading levels. And so when I think about, what are the lessons learned, it's really, I think it's a broad lesson, and I think it goes to Claudio's point about, like, how are we really investing in not just the todays, as we talked about, we were talking backstage about not just investing in today, but really investing in tomorrow. How are we being proactive about crime today and tomorrow at the same time? And I think I fundamentally believe it comes from our investment, both in the public push around our educational system. We can think of it as we can call, wrap it in around inclusivity, or we can talk about it in social justice, but ultimately it impacts us all in terms of the economics of a city and how it's able to really grow and thrive. And I really think that a city will be damned or not based on those things and the investments that we make in it. And so as I think about what's currently happening even in our own state, it often is baffling to me, because we've got to support our children from the very start.
And where would you like to see more support coming from?
Well, I think it's just this overall notion of everything has to be equal. And I realized when I was a teacher some years ago that fair is not always equal. Like, as I look at a classroom of 25, 27, now it's 35 kids in a classroom, like every child needs something a little bit different. And I think that's how we have to begin looking at our schools and our cities and communities even, that fair is not necessarily going to be equal, and that people need different things to really thrive and reach their fullest potential.
So, if we presume that across most of the world, there's going to be a limit in public resources, a lot of this can be addressed by a big increase in public resources. Not everything, but a lot can be. Let's assume we're not going to get them, and that austerity is pretty much the new normal for several years to come. Then, as the phrase goes, we've run out of money. It's time to start thinking. What are the original ideas? The public-private partnerships, the ways of leveraging private money and community involvement that don't involve taxpayer dollars. What examples are we thinking of? And both Liz and Claudio, you put your hand up.
You asked before about what cities are we looking at, and I agree with you that Scandinavian cities are more equal and human and livable cities, so we all look at them. And I'm a stronger believer that more equal societies are less violent societies. And I was just looking up the name of The Spirit Level, this book of Wilkinson and Pickett, about saying, those societies where there's more equality, there's less violence against women, less, obesity, less, crime, because it has to do with the social structure. But let me just point out to a city who used to be only 15 years ago the capital of narco-terrorism in the world, which was Medellin. The highest crime rate ever in world history. And they were able to turn it around in 15 to 20 years. And it's interesting, of course, besides the leadership and the commitment of the people to stop violence, they understood this very basic linkage between urbanism and violence. So they decided that instead of putting all the money in the traditional metro, for example, that you find in many Latin American cities, they will have this, they call it the metro cable. It's kind of a, by air in those areas in the hills where the most poor people lived and where the narcos were making all their money in the sense of, being praised by the people. So they, with the same money, they didn't get more money. They focused in doing excellent infrastructure, both transport, they call it this open libraries in the most poor places of the city. So the best in Medellin right now is in the poor places of Medellin. They call it the social urbanism. And when you realize, for example, in the case of Santiago, in Chile we have 345 boroughs or cities or municipal governments. In Santiago we have 52. 6 of them account for 24% of total cases of domestic violence in the country. Only 6.
Wow.
And if you go to see those places, there are no parks, houses of 45 square meters, there are no squares, there's no police station. So we build these social ghettos, and then we ask why there's so much violence against women or against kids. It's obvious. You don't have a place for them to live as human beings. They will not behave as human beings. And so what you need to do right now is to link. And I think I mentioned Medellin because it was an outlier in terms of violence. And they turned it around in 15 years. Of course, you have a lot of social injustice still in Medellin and poor people. But urbanism changed the way not only the city looks like, but how people feel about their city. Every paisa right now in Antioquia and Medellin say, this is my city, this is our city. It's not only your city. And that really makes a difference.
Was there a particular leader who led this? Presumably Medellin had reached a tipping point, which is what enabled it to make this change. Things had got so bad. Was there a particular inspirational figure who led this, or was this just a consensus that...
Well, I think you always, this is a necessary requirement, but not a sufficient one. You had a leader, you had the tipping point, and you have the collective will to make it happen. And it wasn't only a matter of money. I would say money was the less important of all the other issues. It was the conceptual approach, it was the political priority, and what the time spending in this issue. And I think that, after Medellin did it, anyone can make it happen. And the thing for me, for example, in Santiago, is that I need to convince the haves that the problems of the have-nots are their own problems.
Yes, Lord.
So when I asked you earlier whether you were going to run for president of Chile, you didn't. I think we have our answer. Liz, you were going to mention an example.
No, I think I met my brother from another mother over here. But I fundamentally believe in exactly what Claudio is saying. It's this idea that everything has to be equal, but fair isn't always equal. And so how are we really investing in our neighborhoods when we think about stopping crime and inclusivity and all the things that we're talking about? But you said it well, so it won't be scary.
I just want to pick up on your point about beauty. Because, and again, here we are in Chicago. I remember when I moved to Chicago, I felt like this was the Paris of the United States. In other words, it's the city that cares the most, I think, about the beauty of its public spaces. Look outside, and that is not for all Chicagoans, but it is an investment in public space where there are other American cities where you'd only find that in very, very wealthy parts. But we now know from the neuroscience what beauty does, right? We now know, hospitals know that if you look out on a beautiful view, you heal faster. Just as we now know that the sight of violence and stress creates a cortisol load and changes in your brain that actually affect your ability to learn, right? From a policy point of view, the most important thing we could do is invest in the first 5 years of all our kids' lives, because we're shaping their actual brains. We're not just teaching them stuff, we're shaping them. But so I think it's not just about money, and it isn't just about beautiful spaces. I don't think you want to say, well, you build parks. But I think that point of it actually does have a neurological effect on people, and it also sends a signal that says, you know, somebody cares, right? That it isn't just that. Can you imagine if you just saw nothing but broken, ugly stuff all day? You're getting the message, nobody cares. And it has a physiological effect on you.
Isn't it the case that the World Health Organization said that people that lived less than 20 minutes away from a park have not only longer life expectancy, but less mental health problems? And a Chilean architect that just won the Pritzker Prize worldwide said that, you know, the new way of measuring democracy is the quality of public spaces that people can get freely in their cities. And talking about beauty and, you know, safe places and very small homes. So those who need the public spaces the most are those who live in smaller houses and lack other things.
Absolutely.
But we build the best parks due to this inequality in the richest places, where the people have big houses, they have, you know, houses in the beach. So if we want to make the difference, we have to, you know, influence this other side of looking at urban justice, which is the new name of social justice as well.
And it's an excellent point, the aesthetics, changing the aesthetics of poverty. Presumably, though, this is also a resource question. I mean, you make the very fair point, resources are skewed towards the richest zip codes, just as education spending is in this country. But presumably there's also a resource question here about beautifying some of the uglier parts of town. Are there ways you can do this? I mean, at Fenger High School, was the stuff that you could do or did that made it a more fun school, a more aesthetically pleasant place to come to for kids to get the truancy rates down?
Yeah, I think that's part of what we did. And it wasn't even necessarily like, I don't think we really even looked at any brain research or anything like that. I just know when I walk in the building, it looked very dreary. It was very just dry, and there wasn't any like life and color. And despite what I'm wearing today, I actually like color. And so part of what we did was involve the children in just the pure like decoration and positive messages they would see and seeing themselves on posters on the wall or things like that made them feel some type of ownership and safety within that space, because what our children really had to battle with when they walked outside of our doors was I mean, they had parks, but they couldn't go to the parks because, you know, there's constant, like, there's shooting and people are being killed. And so we tried to create this really safe space that was colorful, that felt like almost an oasis, if you will. And that it didn't just mean like the actual space itself being beautiful, but being safe in terms of having trauma therapy and grief counseling built into the course of the school day, and small groups BAM, if you've heard of the Becoming a Man program, built into the course of our day, and WOW, and things that really supported them so they could, you know, fully just actualize all of their potential. Our kids have so much promise and potential. Oftentimes they get so stigmatized in our media, and we become desensitized to the violence that they face. But at the end of the day, these are children, and so we tried to create a space that really represented the fact that they were children, they were still growing, they were still developing, that we believed in them, because space and kind of how we look at it and how we set it up really determines how we value someone, you know.
So in a minute, I'm going to put you back on the spot, because I noticed none of you answered the model inclusive city question. None of you gave a specific city. By this I mean global city, not your favorite small town. Dorothee, I imagine, so whilst I'm asking Dorothee this, please think of that answer. And then we'll go to audience questions in a moment. If you are and I'm sorry to hammer on this question, but if you are a refugee from a very different culture, and you've arrived in a German city, and you're aware there are political parties rising that don't like you, and they're getting more popular, and you're aware that the media are, presenting you as people who are dangerous to our women, etc., that you could be being demonized, and you might have arrived with no skills. I think we were talking before the panel, you said 1 in 4 of the Syrian refugees had an occupational skill, was that correct? And you don't speak German. I mean, this is a hugely difficult multitasking problem you've got. Bearing in mind what we were just discussing about where you live and the aesthetics of what's around you, is that part of your incorporation of the refugees, that you're not shunting them off into some siding out of public view, that they are there able to access parks and beauty and other amenities?
Well, I think, of course, you're right. First of all, it's a very different culture in Germany. And if they are not able to speak German, it's very bad for them, yes, to integrate in whatever there is in the city. But you don't have only the administrative care or accommodation and care for the refugees, but you have, in Hamburg, we have quite a lot of volunteers who work with the refugees. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very important, that it is not only the administration, the state, who is responsible, of course, for the quite normal accommodation, as I said, and care, and also medical care and education, and school classes for them, and so on. But it's also, it's really badly needed that there are so many volunteers who went from the beginning. Yeah, there are quite a lot of people in all parts of our town who are going, who went to the refugees, talk with them, and I can tell you, in my ministry, every Wednesday, the Mensa is open for the refugees next to us. So there is a container camp, I would say, and the people are invited to come to our house, to our building, and to stay there just only for some hours. And there are people, the employees from our ministry, who go there and invite them to coffee, tea, and some cakes, and then they try to play with the children and do things like that, so that it is more. You need a society to care on refugees.
And you're getting a lot of volunteers.
Yes.
So that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
And so I am going to put you all on the spot.
Right.
Liz,
Right.
your model inclusive city.
I don't have a model in
No, okay, I knew that was going to be the answer.
I don't. I'm gonna be honest with you. As I was preparing to come here and doing some research and talking with my team, we were thinking about this and talking to other people. Like, we didn't come up with one, and so I think that it's all like a work in progress. I think there are lessons that we can all share and learn from one another. I think each of the panel members today has given great insight in terms of ideas on how to do that. But I don't know of one that's kind of got everything right. And I think to even assume that one's got everything right is probably a false notion. But I think we're all on hopefully, all on a path to creating a more inclusive city.
Claudio.
Well, I already mentioned, some of the Scandinavian cities, and the case of Medellin, even though they haven't been able to accomplish everything they wanted, I think they have made a wonderful progress, and it's a sign of hope for all the cities that have big and deep problems in the world. I just wanted to say one thing about the money. You mentioned we have been always talking and thinking of, the government budget, both the local level and the national level. But sometimes, first, there's private money, there's private development. And when you set up policies, urban policies, housing policies, you can, even not in the Singaporean approach, but in a more subtle approach to, condition certain permits to more integration, to condition certain investments in infrastructure that will be more nice and I don't know, nice for humans, for the people. And also the coordination of the public investment. How many times in all of our cities we invest in something, then we break it down and we do something different. I mean, just by coordinating better the public sector investments, you can get so much more value out of them. So I think there's money out there, both in private sector and within the public sector, that with better coordination and leadership, we can get a lot of more value out of it.
So I'm going to give you an answer also, but let me say just on that, as you were talking, I was thinking there's a wonderful book called Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown. And it compares Youngstown, Pennsylvania to Allentown, Pennsylvania, both steel cities, Rust Belt cities, both get hit. One thrives. Allentown really thrives and comes back and is much more inclusive, and the other doesn't. And the key is the participation of the business community, but equally importantly, the diversity of intersecting communities. If it's only, so the argument of the book is that why the Garden Club, classic civil society, can't save Youngstown is the Garden Club are the wives of one set of industrial magnates. Whereas in Allentown, you had people from the Boy Scouts, from the Garden Club, from the various civic organizations, and they intersected enough so that they actually could come together and sort of roll with it. Just as an example that business is critical, but business has to be connected then to other parts of civil society and politicians. So my candidate, there is no perfect inclusive city, not even close, but my candidate is London, which you may be surprised at. But look, once again, London, when I used to go to London as a child, it was all white. When you, or visibly, it obviously wasn't, but you come into Heathrow now and just look at who greets you. And they're all British, but they reflect the world. And they just elected their first Muslim mayor, which is a real statement, right? In this moment, at this time, in Europe, and of course, you know, they're facing Brexit and all of that. So London has lots and lots of problems. I wouldn't say it doesn't at all, but I would say it doesn't have the entrenched racism of African Americans and whites in the United States, a legacy of hundreds of years of human slavery, right? That we are going to take certainly another century to get over. London has class and all sorts of problems, but it also has been able to take generations of immigrants from other countries, particularly in the last 30 years, and create more room for them than I think is true in many cities. How's that for a qualified model?
It's a good answer, and if Brexit happens, it will be because of the rest of the UK will outvote London.
Will outvote London. Yep.
Dorothy.
Well, as I said before, we take some parts of the models of Scandinavian cities and others. And of course, London is a very big city, not comparable to Hamburg.
It's huge.
But yeah, it's huge. But what they are doing there to bring the people together is quite good. But I disagree in one point, because it's not able for the normal people with normal incomes are not able to live in the center of a city.
That is true.
Yeah.
And that has to do with inclusivity.
Yeah,
I agree
that's
with
a
that.
very important
Very important.
inclusivity. So I think we've got some time for questions, about 10 minutes. There are mics going around, but please very briefly state who you are before you ask the question. The gentleman with the glasses there.
Thank you. Scott Bernstein, Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago. Claudio Orrego said something very important that I think you misinterpreted a little bit. When he talked about the value of urbanism, he wasn't just talking about the aesthetics. What got the consensus around building that tramway was that it saved people money. They made a choice about building that instead of building more roads for people who couldn't have afforded the cars to drive on it anyway. When he talked about the 20-minute indicator, it was not only for the aesthetics of access to the parks and the beauty, it was because it was a walkable city and people could get around. So if we're talking about inclusion, we have to be talking about economic inclusion as well. And I think what he put his finger on is that states and cities and all the places that you've talked about do have the authority to replace their infrastructure.
Fair point, but do you have a question?
Yeah, my question, thank you. Well, did I get it right was the first question. But seriously, what do you folks have to say about the kinds of investments that need to be made in real time? Because we have poverty now. Yes, we need to grow the next generation up as more motivated, but we have very high poverty rates right now. And it seems like Claudio's example was an example of a class of activities that we should be investing in right now if we're actually going to get inclusion in anything close to real time. I'd be interested in hearing more from the rest of the panel on that. Thank you.
Claudio?
Well, I completely agree. I think, investments is very politically. I mean, who makes the decision? Politicians. And sometimes you have to make the decision. We have talked about the Scandinavian cities and going against the car, and I'm saying this in the United States of America, is something difficult. When you say, we'll be building higher, roads and highways, or we will be building metros, or public buses, or bicycle cities. So that's a political decision. And where do you put the money? I mean, put your wallet where your mouth is. And I think sometimes we talk so much about social equality, just social justice. But then when you have the investment, all the investment goes to certain activities that, reinforces the inequality you already have in the first place. So you need to break that inertia. I don't know. I think so by building infrastructure of the best possible quality in the most poor neighborhoods in your city, you're making a very strong political statement.
I just want to add to that. So I agree with that, but I also think that it's like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And we have to stop trying to, I agree there has to be some immediate, definitely investments, and there's poverty and everything. We have to begin to think long term. We're talking about summer jobs, and summer jobs are great, but like what is happening like long term when we think about the 40,000 like quote unquote opportunity youth that we have here in North City? How are we all collectively thinking about it? And that's what we're trying to do at Chicago Beyond, is really try not to just, think about small grants, right? Really, it's about like investing long term in doing and in learning what's best for our children.
Right, let's try and get through a few questions. And the lady there.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ambassador. I can't see you very well.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Hi. I wanted the floor because Singapore has been mentioned so much.
I knew you were going to ask a question.
But no, I just want to take half a minute to say something about Singapore, but proceed with the question for the panel. What I want to say is that I think to understand Singapore and what we do about an inclusive city, an inclusive country, it's not just that we dictate where people live. We've avoided ghettoization. There was social engineering there. You put people in the housing estates, Malays, Chinese, Indians, mix them up. There are no ghettos, no ethnic ghettos in Singapore. Today, when you step back and see what has happened in France and elsewhere, even in Britain, actually, Anne-Marie, there are, areas, the Trojan Horse Project, Ed, you would know that, yeah? It shows that you do need to manage diversity. And in Singapore, it's more than just a housing policy. It's a whole series of inclusive policies. And what Mr. Orrego, you are really inspiring, and I agree with everything you said. The idea that you should begin and bring infrastructure and develop the poor areas. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew said, I cannot ensure everybody lives in the same house, in an equal housing, but I can ensure everyone enjoys the same public spaces and the same public parks. And that's exactly what we have.
Before you ask your question, can I throw a question back to you?
Yeah.
Would Lee Kuan Yew have been able to do this in a democracy?
Harder. But in Singapore, there's always talk. The words we use is a social contract. And every election is the remaking of the social contract because people vote against you. It's like a referendum because the opposition parties are so weak. And the governing party takes it very seriously and they correct it. The vote against them is if it's a 40% vote against them, They take that very seriously. And policies, after all, democracy is about how responsive government is to the people.
Okay, and your question.
Yes, my question. My question is actually to the minister from Hamburg, but maybe the others would like to answer that. You know, on the present phenomenon of immigration to Europe, I don't think we've seen anything like this for, not since I was born, you know, and it's been a long time ago. I mean, even when you had Vietnamese refugees and the refugees after World War II coming to the United States, it's not numbers like this which has gone to Europe. So I'm asking, you know, what we talk about inclusiveness and the kinds of policies you can adopt to bring people into society, is that good enough? Do you have to think differently now, change the mindset in how to deal with 1 million refugees coming to Europe?
Oh, yes, of course. It is a great challenge for our society. But let's say, what about the numbers? There are 60 million people as refugees in our world. Just only 15% is coming to Europe. So that's not the great amount of the refugees, but they stay, when they are going from one African state to the other one, or they're coming from Asia or so on and so on. So that's the first thing. It is not that much, and I think we are the wealthy nations, the wealthy countries who can, who are strength enough or have the strength to do that and to integrate them. So of course, probably we made some mistakes, so we have to change it. And we have to see what will happen after a year or 2 years. What about the learning of our language? They have to, otherwise they can't be professionally skilled and go to jobs. But they need jobs and employment. So did we do enough? So it was such a difficult situation in the beginning, just to give them housing, to give them something to eat and clothes. And now, after a while, we know that we have a very big challenge, that all the and mostly unskilled young men that were coming, have to be integrated in our workforce. So that's I think, so after a while we have to think on our to rethink our strategy, of course, but so it takes some time, I would say.
So we have 39 seconds on the clock. If I could have a very efficient question of the gentleman there, and a staccato question, staccato answers.
Earl Sewell here, a professor of English and literature. My question to you guys is that you all have talked about education. My specific question is, what does education look like to you? Is it a global education, or is it more of an education that just helps you to deal within your particular countries or societies?
Wow.
It's hard to give a staccato answer, but well done for keeping it as a short question. Liz, can you shoehorn Anne-Marie, please, and Claudia, I mean, all of you, feel free to give brief, really wise,
We're now at 0, 0, 0.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my brief answer is that it has to be global, right? I mean, that's really what the world is now. And so to think it can be anything less than that, I think, is selling our kids and really our country ultimately short. So that's my very
So thumbs up for global. Claudio.
answer.
We agree that it has to be global, but not only on technical data that you give to the kids. I mean, we need this new generation to learn how to learn by themselves. Everything's going to change so many times in their lifetime that it's not the usual education that we're talking about, not even the global one. It's not talking about the world, but rather giving them the tools to be able to deal in this world. However, and going back to what we were talking with Liz prior to this panel, I'm afraid that we're talking about global education when we have kids out of the schools. So how are we able at the same time to provide this new and global education for the majority, to not let down or away or behind that amount of kids in our population that is not in school. And they will require a different education, sometimes more basic, maybe 2 years in one, maybe different schools. But for me, the new social atomic bomb in our society is our kids out of school. So we have to do something with them as well.
Anne-Marie, I'll give you the last word.
So two quick things on education. One, the global, but actually focusing on the local. When a kid speaks Spanish at home or any other language at home and then comes in and speaks English and learns how to go back and forth, or moves from the black part of town to the Hispanic part of town and with the cultural differences, that's cultural competence. It's the same cultural competence that I grew up with going between Belgium and the United States. And it's happening in our cities, and we should be praising it and building on it as a cultural competence that is valuable globally, but also, frankly, for navigating, at least American society, as it grows. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm not pandering to you because you're an English professor, but speaking as the former dean of a school of public policy, we are all about statistics and economics, and now we're all about STEM, and okay, great. But what allows us to live together here, look at, I know it's the pantheon of dead white men, but even so, a lot of them are great writers, and thinkers. It is literature that allows us to put ourselves in other people's shoes. We read, it's called the humanities for a reason. We read great literature and we think to ourselves, I can imagine myself being that person, and I can be in that ethical dilemma, and I can feel when that mother loses her baby, and I can understand the despair of that man who is fighting. So we are in danger when we think about education and our focus on being competitive of losing the very part of the humanities that keeps us human and allows us to live with each other. So there you are.
Good. Love your answer.
Thank you.
So true.
A rousing
Too
note
much
on
math,
which to end.
too much grammar.
Thank you to all the panel.
Some humanities
The next
on
one's
it,
in 15 minutes, right?
And civic
Please join
engagement
me
as
in
well.
thanking again our moderator and panelists. We will now break until 3:23 p.m. and promptly return, as Ed would say, in staccato style, at which time we will welcome Todd Hone to the stage, and following his flash talk, the second